Before we begin today's story, I want to thank you for joining me on this dark journey into America's forgotten corners. If you're watching this from somewhere in Appalachia, you might want to check your doors are locked. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one you'll find in history books. It was systematically removed, page by page, file by file. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, have you ever heard whispers about hillbillies who simply vanished from your town's history? Mountain folk whose names were struck from church records, whose homes were reclaimed by the forest as if they never existed at all. This is the story of how an entire community of Appalachian hillbillies began disappearing from Crower's Gap, a small mining settlement nestled deep in the hollows of West Virginia's most isolated mountains. A place where in 1904, the census taker arrived to find 27 people missing, not just gone, erased, their belongings still in place, cornbread half-eaten, moonshine jars left open, but their names scratched out of the town ledger with such force the pages were torn. The census taker, Elijah Mercer, noted something peculiar in his private journal, which wasn't discovered until decades later in his grandson's attic. The strangest thing about Crower's Gap isn't what I found, but what the remaining hill folk refuse to see. They step around empty chairs at the dinner table and continue conversations as if someone still sits there. When asked directly about the Parkerson family, whose home stands empty at the edge of town, they simply stare through me as if I've spoken in a foreign tongue. What makes this case so disturbing isn't just the disappearances, but the collective amnesia that followed. Or perhaps it wasn't amnesia at all, but something far more deliberate, as if the entire mountain community had made a pact to forget. Crower's Gap had always been the kind of place outsiders avoided. Nestled between two steep mountain ridges, the only road in followed an old creek bed that flooded 8 months of the year. The town existed because of coal, a rich seam discovered in 1867 that brought the railroad and, with it, desperate men willing to spend their days in darkness. These were true hillbillies, proud, independent mountain folk with customs and ways older than the nation itself. By 1904, most of the easily accessible coal had been exhausted, and the Crower's Gap Mining Company was digging deeper, following the black veins further into the mountain's heart. The Parkerson family had been there since the beginning. Obadiah Parkerson, a fierce hillbilly patriarch known for his distrust of outsiders and encyclopedic knowledge of mountain remedies, had been among the first to stake a claim, building a sturdy 2-story home overlooking the town where he lived with his wife Esther and their 5 children. Their eldest son, Thomas, had taken over as foreman when his father's lungs finally surrendered to the coal dust in 1899. The Parkersons weren't well liked, but they were respected. They kept to themselves, attended church on Sundays, and paid fair wages by the standards of the day. What most folks didn't know was how Thomas kept such detailed records of every family in Crower's Gap. In a leather-bound ledger locked in his desk drawer, he noted births, marriages, disputes, debts, and secrets, especially secrets. Knowledge is better than coal, his father had told him. It burns longer. The town had its rhythms. Each morning before dawn, men would shuffle toward the mine entrance, tin lunch boxes swinging at their sides. Women would gather at the communal wash basin near the creek, scrubbing clothes against washboards and exchanging whispered stories about whose husband had come home with bruised knuckles, whose daughter was showing before her wedding day. Children attended the one-room schoolhouse until they were old enough to work. 12 for the boys who would join their fathers in the mine, 14 for the girls who might find positions as maids in the larger town of Elkinford, 20 miles away. The mountain folk carried their traditions quietly, passing down folk remedies, brewing moonshine and hidden stills, singing the old ballads that had crossed the ocean with their ancestors. The silence was what visitors noticed first. Despite being home to over 200 souls, Crower's Gap maintained an unnatural quiet. People spoke in hushed tones, even in their own homes. Windows were kept shuttered, even in summer heat. "It's the mountain," locals would explain to the rare outsider. "It listens." But beneath this quiet surface, tensions had been building. The winter of 1903 had been brutal. 3 children had died of fever, and the mine had collapsed twice, claiming 7 men. Food was scarce, and the company store had raised its prices again. Thomas Parkerson had been seen arguing with representatives from the mining company, his voice echoing across the town square in a rare display of public emotion. "You can't keep pushing them like this," he'd shouted. "These are people, not mules." The company man had simply straightened his tie and replied, too quietly for most to hear, "That's a matter of perspective, Mr. Parkerson." It began with a sound. At least that's how Lily Mercer described it to her husband Elijah before he left for his census-taking duties. "Like the mountain clearing its throat," she said, rocking slowly on their porch one evening in late February. "Happened just after midnight. Woke me from a dead sleep." 2 nights later, the sound came again. This time several people heard it, a low, rumbling groan that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. The children of Crower's Gap began to complain of headaches. Dogs refused to eat. The chickens at the Wilcox farm laid eggs with shells so thin they cracked at the slightest touch. "It's just the mine settling," Thomas Parkerson assured everyone at the town meeting held in the church. Nothing to be concerned about. But that night he wrote something different in his private journal. "It's coming from the north shaft, the one the company ordered sealed last autumn. I told them it wasn't safe, that the support beams were rotting, but it would have cost too much to replace them. Now something's shifting down there, and God help us all if that seal breaks." The next day, 10-year-old Samuel Thatcher didn't come home for supper. His mother, Ada, went looking, knocking on doors across town. "Have you seen my Samuel?" she asked, her voice growing more frantic with each negative response. By nightfall, a search party had been organized. They combed the woods with lanterns, called his name into the darkness. It was Thomas Parkerson who found the boy's cap snagged on a thorn bush near the sealed entrance to the north shaft, the entrance that, according to company records, had been blocked with timber and rock and earth so thoroughly that not even a squirrel could find its way in. Yet the seal had been disturbed. A narrow opening, just wide enough for a small boy to squeeze through, had somehow formed. Thomas insisted on going in alone. "The rest of you stay here," he commanded. "The air might be bad." He was gone for nearly an hour. When he emerged, his face was gray with dust and something else, a bloodless pallor that made him look twice his 40 years. "No sign of him," was all he said. "The tunnel collapsed about 50 yards in. He couldn't have gone that way." They continued searching through the night, but Samuel Thatcher was never found. His mother took to sitting on her front porch, rocking and humming softly, her eyes fixed on the path leading to her door. 3 days later, she stopped speaking altogether. A week after that, Elijah Mercer would find her home empty, the rocking chair still moving slightly in the morning breeze. "There's been an accident at the Thatcher home," the town doctor told the small crowd that had gathered. "Ada took her own life last night. The grief was too much for her to bear." No one asked to see the body. No one asked about funeral arrangements. The next Sunday, the preacher made no mention of Ada during the service. Her name was crossed out of the church register. Her house stood empty, the doors unlocked, a pot of stew still hanging over a cold fireplace. And when Thomas Parkerson updated his ledger that night, he wrote only, "Thatcher, A, removed." The disappearances accelerated after that. First, the Wilcox family, parents and 3 children, gone one morning without explanation. Their farm animals stood unfed in their pens, lowing in hunger until neighbors finally came to claim them. Then old Mr. Holloway, who'd lost both legs in a mining accident years before and spent his days whittling on his front porch. His wheelchair was found empty, a half-finished wooden bird still clutched in the seat. Each time, the same pattern emerged. No signs of struggle, no packed bags, no goodbyes. And each time, the remaining townspeople adjusted with disturbing ease. They redistributed the abandoned possessions, moved into the empty homes, and spoke of the missing as if they'd simply decided to try their luck elsewhere. The Wilcox family, Moved to Ohio, I heard. Better farming there. Old Holloway? His daughter came and got him. Lives in Pittsburgh now, I believe. But there were no daughters, no relatives, no plans for Ohio. There were only the silent houses and the names, methodically crossed out in Thomas Parkerson's ledger. Elijah Mercer wouldn't have known any of this had he not been assigned to conduct the census in Crower's Gap. He arrived on a warm day in early May, his satchel filled with official forms, his mind preoccupied with the argument he'd had with Lily before leaving. She'd begged him not to go. "That place isn't right, Elijah," she'd insisted. "My cousin tried to deliver mail there last year and came back changed. Said the people looked through him like he was made of smoke." Elijah had laughed off her concerns. "Superstitious nonsense," he'd said. "These mountain folk just don't like outsiders asking questions." He wouldn't be laughing by the time he left Crower's Gap 3 days later, his census forms incomplete, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins of his horse. When Elijah Mercer arrived in Crower's Gap, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town, but a heavy, watchful silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. The second thing he noticed was how the hillbillies moved, with a careful precision, as if walking between invisible obstacles. These weren't the boisterous, fiercely independent mountain folk he'd encountered in other parts of Appalachia. These people moved like they were being watched, like something had dampened their notorious hillbilly spirit. He set up his temporary office in the back room of the general store, pinning a notice to the door. "Census taking. All residents required to register." By noon, no one had come. The storekeeper, a gaunt man named Jenkins, offered no explanation, just shook his head when Elijah asked if he'd seen the notice. "Hillfolk'll come when they're ready," was all he said. Finally, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, Elijah decided to go door to door. The first house belonged to a family called Addison. A woman answered, her face as blank as an unwritten page, though her calloused hands and the traditional quilting patterns on her apron spoke to her deep Appalachian roots. When Elijah explained his purpose, she invited him in with a mechanical gesture. The home's interior struck him immediately. 6 chairs around the dining table, 6 plates set out, but only the woman and 2 children were present. He noticed a dulcimer hanging on the wall, its strings dusty with disuse, and jars of preserved foods lining shelves, typical hillbilly self-sufficiency. "I'll need the names of all household members," Elijah said, pen poised over his form. "Just the 3 of us," the woman replied, though her eyes flicked nervously to the empty chairs. "But the place settings," Elijah began. "Just the 3 of us," she repeated, her voice hardening, the mountain accent thickening with her tension. Similar scenes played out at every house he visited. Homes prepared for residents who weren't there. Names mentioned in passing that no one would acknowledge when directly questioned. By sunset, Elijah had documented only half the town's apparent population. He returned to the room he'd rented above the general store, intending to continue his work the next day. That night he was awakened by voices below his window, a heated argument taking place in hushed tones. Peering through the dusty glass, he saw Thomas Parkerson engaged in what appeared to be a fierce disagreement with 3 other men. Though he couldn't make out the words, the tension was unmistakable. It ended abruptly when Parkerson slammed his fist against the wall of the building and stalked away. The next morning, Elijah noticed a change in the town's atmosphere. The hillbillies avoided his gaze more deliberately. Doors closed as he approached. The few who did speak with him gave clipped, rehearsed-sounding answers, and Thomas Parkerson was watching him, not openly, but Elijah would catch glimpses of the man observing from doorways or around corners. The sense of being stalked prickled at the back of his neck. Determined to complete his assignment, Elijah pressed on with the census. He'd been instructed to record every individual residing in Crower's Gap, and he intended to do just that, even those the townspeople seemed determined to erase. In the town records, which the reluctant clerk eventually allowed him to view, Elijah found numerous entries that had been crossed out with such violence that the pen had torn through the paper. When he asked about these names, the clerk's face drained of color. "Those were mistakes," he said. "Clerical errors. Never should have been recorded in the first place." Elijah wasn't convinced. That afternoon he made his way to the Parkerson house on the hill overlooking the town. Unlike the other homes he'd visited, this one showed no signs of missing occupants. Everything was in its place, orderly and undisturbed. Thomas Parkerson received him in a wood-paneled study lined with books, an unusual luxury in a mining town. "I understand you're having some difficulty with your census," Parkerson said, not waiting for Elijah to explain his presence. "The people here are private by nature. They don't appreciate government intrusion." Elijah cleared his throat. "It's more than privacy, Mr. Parkerson. There are discrepancies, empty homes with personal belongings still inside. Names in the town records that have been struck out. People setting places at their tables for family members they claim don't exist." Parkerson's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A calculation being made. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Mercer?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Elijah replied carefully. "I'm simply trying to do my job, to count everyone who lives in Crower's Gap. And if they're no longer here to be counted, then I need to know where they've gone. Death certificates for the deceased, forwarding addresses for those who've moved on." Parkerson leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah with an intensity that made the census taker's skin crawl. "You seem like an intelligent man, Mr. Mercer, a man who understands that some questions are better left unasked." He stood abruptly, moving to a cabinet from which he withdrew a bottle and 2 glasses. "Whiskey?" Elijah declined with a shake of his head. Parkerson poured himself a generous measure and drank it in one swallow. "The thing about small towns, Mr. Mercer, is that they survive by consensus. When the majority agrees on a truth, that truth becomes reality, regardless of facts to the contrary." He set his glass down with a sharp click. "I suggest you complete your census with the information you've been given. Return to Elkinford. File your report. Forget the inconsistencies you think you found here." That night, unable to sleep, Elijah found himself drawn to the abandoned Thatcher home. The door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the night breeze. Inside, dust motes danced in the beam of his lantern. The home looked as if its occupants had simply stepped out for a moment. A child's toy soldiers arranged in battle formation on the floor, a woman's shawl draped over a chair back, a Bible open on the table. Handmade crafts typical of hillbilly artisanship adorned the walls, a whittled chain carved from a single piece of wood, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling rafters, a hand-sewn quilt with a distinctive mountain pattern draped over a rocking chair. Elijah moved through the rooms, documenting what he found in his personal notebook. In the back bedroom, a small pair of boys' boots stood neatly by the bed, Samuel's, presumably. Beside them, half hidden under the bed frame, Elijah spotted a tarnished metal box. Inside was a child's treasure trove, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a carved wooden whistle, the kind hillbilly children would use to mimic whippoorwills. And at the bottom, folded carefully, a sheet of paper covered in a child's uneven handwriting. It was dated February 23, 1904, 3 days before Samuel disappeared. "Dear God," it read, "I know I'm not supposed to be scared because Dad says fear is for women and babies, but I can't help it. I hear them at night, scratching inside the walls. Mom says it's just mice, but mice don't whisper. Yesterday after school, I followed the sounds to the old mine shaft, the one that's supposed to be closed up. There's a way in now. I saw Mr. Parkerson coming out of it. He didn't see me. He was covered in dirt and something dark that wasn't dirt. He was carrying papers. I'm going to see what's in there tomorrow. Please don't let the whispering things get me." Elijah's blood ran cold. He carefully placed the note in his pocket and continued his search. In the kitchen, he found something odd. A small pile of coal dust on the otherwise clean floor, arranged in what appeared to be a crude symbol. Beside it, a mason jar of clear moonshine stood half empty, as if whoever had been drinking had left in a hurry. He sketched the symbol in his notebook, then heard a noise from outside, footsteps approaching the house. Quickly extinguishing his lantern, Elijah concealed himself behind a doorway. Through the window, he could make out several figures moving toward the house. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but there was something wrong about the way they moved, a jerking, puppet-like quality that made his stomach clench. He remained frozen in place until they passed by, continuing down the road toward the mine. Only when they were out of sight did he dare to breathe again. He waited until dawn before leaving the Thatcher house, making his way back to his rented room as the first gray light seeped into the valley. He packed his belongings with shaking hands. Census be damned. He needed to get out of Crower's Gap, to report what he'd found to someone with authority. As he mounted his horse, Thomas Parkerson emerged from the shadow of the general store. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Mercer?" There was something different about the man this morning, a haggard quality to his features, dark circles beneath his eyes. "Unfinished business in Elkinford," Elijah lied. "I'll return to complete the census next week." Parkerson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, Crower's Gap is now closed to outsiders, by order of the mining company." He held up an official-looking document. "Health concerns. Something in the water, they say." His gaze dropped to Elijah's saddlebag, where the corner of his notebook was visible. "I hope you haven't been recording unauthorized observations, Mr. Mercer. The company takes a dim view of industrial espionage." "This isn't about the mining company," Elijah said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's about the people who've gone missing. The names crossed out in your records: Samuel Thatcher, his mother, the Wilcox family, old Mr. Holloway." "What happened to them, Mr. Parkerson?" For a moment, something like genuine anguish crossed Thomas Parkerson's face. "They're gone," he said simply, "and the rest of us have agreed to forget them. I suggest you do the same." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The company is watching, Mr. Mercer. They're always watching. What happens in their town stays in their town." "Those are the rules," Elijah urged his horse forward, brushing past Parkerson. "The United States government doesn't recognize your rules, sir. When my report reaches Washington—" "It won't," Parkerson interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. "But you needn't worry about that now. Just ride, Mr. Mercer. Ride fast, and don't look back. And if you value your life and the lives of your family, never speak of what you've seen in Crower's Gap." Elijah didn't need to be told twice. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks and galloped out of town, the leather-bound notebook secure in his inner pocket. He didn't slow until he had crested the mountain pass and the town was hidden from view behind him. Only then did he pause to catch his breath and consider what he had learned. His official census forms were incomplete, useless, but his personal observations, the note from Samuel Thatcher, the strange symbol he had sketched, these might be enough to convince the authorities that something terrible was happening in Crower's Gap. He reached Elkinford by nightfall, exhausted but determined. The local sheriff listened to his story with increasing skepticism. "Sounds like mountain superstition to me," he said, lighting a cigar. "Those mining towns are always full of strange tales. People come and go all the time, chasing work or running from debts." "These people didn't go anywhere," Elijah insisted. "Their belongings were still in their homes, meals still on their tables. And the townspeople, they're afraid to even speak of the missing." The sheriff sighed. "Look, Mercer, Crower's Gap is company property. What happens there is between the mining company and its employees. We don't have jurisdiction unless they ask for our help. Then I'll take it higher. To the state authorities, to Washington if necessary." The sheriff's expression hardened. "I wouldn't if I were you. The Crower's Gap Mining Company has friends in high places, very high. You start making accusations without proof, you'll find yourself without a job, or worse." "I have proof," Elijah said, reaching for his notebook, but when he opened it, his blood ran cold. The pages containing his observations from the Thatcher house, the sketch of the symbol, his notes on the missing residents, all had been torn out. Samuel Thatcher's letter was gone from his pocket. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I had it right here." The sheriff gave him a pitying look. "Go home, Mercer. Get some rest. Forget about Crower's Gap." But Elijah couldn't forget. Not even when he returned to his own home, to Lily's worried embrace. Not when his supervisor accepted his incomplete census with surprising indifference. Not when strange men began to appear in town, asking questions about him, watching his house from across the street. 3 weeks after his return from Crower's Gap, Elijah Mercer was offered a promotion, a position in the Census Bureau's Washington office at double his current salary. "A recognition of your exceptional service," the letter stated. Lily was overjoyed. Elijah understood it for what it was, a bribe or a threat, perhaps both. 20 years passed. Elijah Mercer never spoke publicly of what he had witnessed in Crower's Gap. He accepted the promotion, moved his family to Washington, and built a respectable career in the Census Bureau. But in private, he continued his investigation. He collected newspaper clippings about the Crower's Gap Mining Company. He corresponded discreetly with journalists and academics interested in labor conditions in Appalachia. He tracked down former residents who had left the town before the disappearances began. Slowly, a pattern emerged, not just in Crower's Gap, but in other company towns across the region. Disappearances explained away, records altered, memories collectively reshaped. In 1919, he received an unexpected visitor at his Washington office, an elderly man with gnarled hands and the hollow-eyed look of someone who had spent too many years underground. "You don't know me," the man said, "but I know you. You're the census taker who came to Crower's Gap in '04. The man introduced himself as William Cooper, a former miner who had fled the town shortly after Elijah's visit. "I was there when it happened," Cooper said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When they took the Parkerson family." Elijah's pen stilled above his notepad. "The Parkersons disappeared too?" Cooper nodded. "Thomas was the last. He fought the hardest against it, you see. Kept records of everyone who vanished, tried to warn people. But in the end, they got him too." "Who got him?" Elijah asked. "What happened in that town?" Cooper glanced nervously at the office door. "It wasn't what happened. It's what they found. In the north shaft. The one that was supposed to be sealed." He leaned closer. "It wasn't coal they discovered deep in that mountain, Mr. Mercer. It was something else. Something old. Something that had been buried for a reason." "What are you talking about?" "There's a reason they chose those mountains for mining," Cooper continued, as if Elijah hadn't spoken. "The company knew what was down there. They'd found similar deposits in other locations. They called it black mercury, a substance that looked like liquid coal but behaved like something alive, something aware." Elijah fought the urge to dismiss the man as delusional. "And this substance caused the disappearances?" Cooper shook his head. "Not directly. It was what it did to people's minds. Those who were exposed to it began to change. They'd grow distant, paranoid. They'd have conversations with empty chairs. And then, one day, they'd insist that someone who had been there all along, a wife, a child, a neighbor, had never existed at all." He ran a trembling hand over his face. "I saw it happen to my own brother. One morning he couldn't remember his son's name. By evening he was asking why I kept mentioning a boy who'd never been born. A week later my nephew was gone, just erased, and my brother couldn't see anything wrong with that." "But why?" Elijah asked. "What purpose could this possibly serve?" "The company called it population management," Cooper replied. "The substance let them edit reality, in a way. Remove troublemakers, people who asked too many questions, people who might organize unions or demand better conditions." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small glass vial containing what appeared to be black sand. "I took this before I left. Been carrying it with me all these years as proof. Because without it, who would believe such a story?" Elijah stared at the vial, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The contents didn't look extraordinary, just fine black particles like coal dust, but something about the way they shifted in the glass, almost like they were responding to being observed, made the hair on his arms stand on end. "May I?" he asked, reaching for the vial. Cooper hesitated, then placed it in Elijah's palm. "Be careful not to open it. Brief exposure probably won't harm you, but I wouldn't risk it." The vial was unexpectedly warm to the touch. As Elijah turned it in the light, the particles seemed to align themselves, forming patterns that dissolved as soon as he tried to focus on them. What did they do with it? The company, I mean. Cooper's expression darkened. Experiments at first? They discovered that when introduced into a closed community, a town they controlled completely, the substance could be used to alter collective perception. One person exposed would affect 2 others. Those 2 would affect 4 more. Soon, an entire population could be made to forget individuals who had been removed from the official record. But that's impossible? Cooper gave a bitter laugh. That's what I thought too, until I watched my sister-in-law carefully set a place at the table for her son, then insist moments later that she'd never had a child. Until I saw my friend step around a man collapsed in the street as if he wasn't there. Until I found myself starting to question my own memories. He tapped the vial in Elijah's hand. They refined it, you know, found ways to target specific memories, specific people. By 1906, they could remove a troublemaker from a town's consciousness without affecting memories of anything else. By 1910, they were selling the technology to other companies, other industries. Elijah carefully placed the vial on his desk. If what you're saying is true, this would be the greatest conspiracy in American history. And the most effective, Cooper agreed. Because once it's done, there's no conspiracy to uncover, no victims to speak out. No families demanding justice for the disappeared, just a collective agreement that certain people never existed at all. Why are you telling me this now? After all these years? Cooper's rheumy eyes fixed on Elijah's face. Because they're expanding the program, moving beyond the mining towns, into cities, government agencies. The war gave them the perfect cover. So many young men not coming home, so many records lost in the chaos. He pointed a gnarled finger at the census report stacked on Elijah's desk. They're in your department now, Mr. Mercer, identifying candidates for removal, people whose absence wouldn't be noticed, people whose disappearance would be convenient. Elijah thought of the strange directives that had crossed his desk in recent months. The lists of names to be verified, the new cataloging system that flagged certain households for special review. He'd assumed it was all part of the modernization process, the government becoming more efficient after the lessons of wartime. Now a more sinister possibility presented itself. What can I do, he asked. Warn people? Go to the newspapers? Cooper shook his head wearily. They control too much now. The newspapers, the police, parts of the government itself. No, what we need is evidence that can't be erased. Records they can't alter. He reached into his coat again, this time producing a small leather journal. This belonged to Thomas Parkerson. I took it from his house the night before they came for him. It documents everything. The first discoveries in the mine, the early experiments, the names of everyone who disappeared from Crower's Gap. He placed the journal on the desk beside the vial. I've spent 20 years hiding this, making copies, sending them to people I thought I could trust. Most disappeared. Some came back marked, address unknown. A few got through, I think, hidden away where they might someday be found. Elijah took the journal with reverent care, opening it to find page after page of meticulous documentation in a tight, controlled handwriting. Names, dates, detailed observations, diagrams of the mine shafts, chemical formulas, and on the final pages, a desperate plea. To whoever finds this record, I have failed to stop what is happening here. They are coming for me now. I can hear them on the stairs. By morning, no one in Crower's Gap will remember that I or my family ever existed. Our home will stand empty. Our name will be struck from the town records, but somewhere, beyond their reach, let this truth survive. The last entry was dated June 7, 1904, just 1 month after Elijah had fled the town. I'll need time, Elijah said, looking up from the journal, to make copies, to find safe places for them. Cooper nodded. Time is something I don't have much of anymore. The black mercury, even limited exposure, changes you. Slowly. I've held out longer than most, but I can feel it working on me. Some mornings I wake up and can't remember my wife's face. Some nights I dream of people I've never met, only to realize they're the disappeared ones, reaching through whatever barrier separates them from our world." He stood with effort, his joints creaking. "I'll contact you again in 1 week. If you haven't heard from me by then, well, you'll know what happened. Where are you staying? Let me help you." "No," Cooper cut him off. "Better you don't know. Better we're not seen together more than necessary." He moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing, Mr. Mercer. The symbol you found in the Thatcher house, the one made of coal dust on the floor, did it look like this?" With a trembling finger, he traced a pattern in the dust on Elijah's desk. A simple design of 3 connected circles, each containing what appeared to be a stylized eye. Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. "Yes, exactly like that." "What does it mean?" "It's how they mark the homes they're going to visit. A warning, perhaps, or a claim of ownership. The Thatcher boy must have seen it and understood what was coming." Cooper brushed the dust away, destroying the symbol. "If you ever see this mark again, in your home, your office, anywhere, run. Don't pack, don't say goodbye. Just run and never stop looking over your shoulder." True to his word, William Cooper contacted Elijah exactly 1 week later, not in person, but through a letter delivered by courier. It contained only 3 sentences. "They found me. The enclosed must survive. Trust no one." Attached was a small map marked with locations across the Appalachian region, each annotated with a date and a number. Elijah recognized them immediately as the sites of other mining operations, owned by the same company that controlled Crower's Gap. Each marking, he suspected, represented another community, where people had been systematically erased from existence. That night, Elijah made his decision. He would take the evidence, the journal, the vial, the map, and hide it where the company couldn't find it. Not in a government archive or a university library, where influential hands could easily remove it, but somewhere personal, somewhere overlooked. He carefully wrapped the items in oilcloth and sealed them in a metal box, which he then concealed in the false bottom of his daughter's hope chest, a wedding gift he was crafting in his spare time. She was only 16, not yet engaged, but the chest would remain with her through her married life, passed down eventually to her own children, a family heirloom carrying a terrible secret. The years passed. Elijah Mercer continued his work at the Census Bureau, watching with growing unease as the patterns Cooper had described became more pronounced. Certain neighborhoods in major cities would show population declines that couldn't be explained by normal migration. Entire family lines would disappear from the records between one census and the next. Government files would be reclassified, relocated, or simply vanish from the archives. He documented what he could, adding his observations to Parkinson's journal, but he was careful not to draw attention to himself. He had a family to protect. In 1924, his daughter married and moved to Philadelphia, taking the hope chest and its hidden contents with her. Elijah breathed easier, knowing the evidence was beyond his immediate vicinity. He retired from the Census Bureau in 1929, just as the Great Depression was beginning to tighten its grip on the nation. He and Lily moved to a small farm in Maryland, where they lived quietly, growing vegetables and raising chickens. He corresponded regularly with his daughter and grandchildren, but never visited their home in Philadelphia, never saw the hope chest again. He died in 1937 of a heart attack, taking most of his secrets to the grave. Lily survived him by only 8 months. Their modest estate was divided among their children, their papers stored in boxes that would pass from one family member to another over the decades, largely forgotten. And Crower's Gap? The town lingered for a few more years after the events of 1904, growing smaller and quieter with each passing season. The mine was officially closed in 1912, the equipment salvaged, the entrances sealed more permanently than before. The remaining residents drifted away, seeking work elsewhere as the company town died around them. By 1920, Crower's Gap was abandoned, its buildings slowly reclaimed by the forest. It became one of hundreds of ghost towns scattered throughout Appalachia, unremarkable except to the occasional historian or genealogist trying to trace a family line that seemed to vanish into thin air. The Crowers Gap Mining Company was absorbed by larger corporations, its records transferred, microfilmed, stored in various archives where they gathered dust. The men who had made the decisions, who had authorized the experiments with black mercury, who had ordered the systematic erasure of troublesome individuals, they rose through the ranks of industry and government, their methods becoming more sophisticated, their operations more deeply embedded in the machinery of power. And the substance itself? The company continued to refine it, to study its properties, to discover new applications. During World War II, it was weaponized, tested on prisoners of war and certain domestic populations deemed expendable. In the Cold War era, it became a tool of espionage, a way to remove agents whose covers had been blown not just from their positions but from memory itself. By the 1960s, synthetic versions were being produced in laboratories far from the Appalachian Mountains, where it had first been discovered. The original source in the sealed north shaft of the Crowers Gap mine was all but forgotten, a footnote in classified documents read by fewer people with each passing decade, until 1976, when Thomas Parkerson's journal finally resurfaced. It was Howard Mercer, Elijah's grandson, who found it. While cleaning out his mother's attic after her death, he discovered the hope chest that had been part of her trousseau over 50 years earlier. The false bottom had warped with age, revealing its secret compartment. Inside, preserved in oilcloth that had grown brittle with time, he found the metal box containing Parkerson's journal, Cooper's map, and a vial of what appeared to be black sand. Having heard fragments of his grandfather's stories as a child, dismissed by the family as the ramblings of an old man, Howard was stunned to discover physical evidence that the tales might have been true. A history professor at a small college in Vermont, Howard had the academic resources to begin investigating the journal's claims. He started with the locations marked on Cooper's map, many of which corresponded to abandoned mining towns, similar to Crowers Gap. In each case, he found the same pattern, a period of prosperity followed by unexplained population decline, often accompanied by gaps in the official records. Names that appeared in church registries but not in census data. Graves without corresponding death certificates. Newspaper accounts that mentioned individuals who seemed to vanish from all other documentation. But it was when Howard began researching the corporate history of the Crowers Gap Mining Company that he encountered resistance. Archives that should have been public were classified or missing. Librarians who had initially been helpful became cold and evasive when he mentioned specific company names. A colleague who had offered to assist him suddenly took a sabbatical and couldn't be reached. Then the break-ins began. First his office at the college, then his home. Nothing of obvious value was taken, but his papers were disturbed, his research notes rearranged. One morning he found a strange symbol drawn in the condensation on his bathroom mirror. 3 connected circles, each containing a stylized eye. The symbol from his grandfather's notes. The warning. That same day, Howard made photocopies of Parkerson's journal and Cooper's map. He mailed them to trusted colleagues at other institutions with instructions to keep them sealed unless they heard from him. The vial of black particles he couldn't copy, so he resealed it in its oilcloth wrapping and buried it in his garden beneath a rose bush. That night, men came to his house. He escaped through a back window as they broke down his front door, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and his car keys. For the next 2 years, Howard Mercer lived on the move, staying in cheap motels under assumed names, working odd jobs for cash and continuing his research in public libraries, far from his home state. He compiled his findings into a manuscript titled The Erased Corporate Experimentation and Disappeared Populations in Appalachia, 1904-1972. He mailed copies to publishers, journalists, and government officials he thought might be sympathetic to his cause. Most were returned unopened. Some disappeared entirely. One editor expressed interest, then died in what was ruled a hiking accident before contracts could be signed. In 1978, increasingly paranoid and in failing health, Howard took a desperate gamble. He returned to where it had all begun, the abandoned site of Crower's Gap. Little remained of the town. The forest had reclaimed most of the buildings, leaving only stone foundations and the occasional rusted piece of machinery to mark where homes and businesses had once stood. The mine entrances had been sealed decades ago. The main shaft collapsed in a controlled detonation after the company departed. But the north shaft, the one Thomas Parkerson had mentioned in his journal, where the black mercury had first been discovered, that was what Howard had come to find. According to Parkerson's notes, this shaft had been sealed hastily, its location deliberately obscured on official maps. It had been the site of the first disappearance, young Samuel Thatcher, whose curiosity had led him to discover something the company wanted hidden. For 3 days, Howard searched the mountainside, comparing Parkerson's hand-drawn maps to the altered landscape. On the 4th day, as the autumn sun was setting, he found it, a depression in the earth, overgrown with briars but distinctly unnatural in its symmetry. Beneath the tangled vegetation was a concrete cap cracked with age but still solidly in place. Howard made camp nearby, planning to return the next day with tools to break through the seal. But that night, he was awakened by a sound, a low, rumbling groan that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth. The same sound that Lily Mercer had described to her husband, Elijah, in 1904, like the mountain clearing its throat. Howard sat up in his sleeping bag, heart pounding. The sound came again, followed by something else, a whispering so faint he couldn't be sure he was actually hearing it, words just at the edge of comprehension, spoken in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He fumbled for his flashlight, sweeping its beam across the campsite. The light caught movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure standing motionless among the trees. As Howard watched, paralyzed with fear, more figures emerged from the darkness. Men, women, children, dozens of them, forming a silent circle around his camp. Their clothing was old-fashioned, their faces pale in the moonlight, and their eyes. Howard would later write in his final journal entry that their eyes were black pools, reflecting nothing, seeing everything. For hours they stood watching him, never speaking, never moving closer. When dawn broke, they were gone. But on the concrete cap sealing the north shaft, Howard found a familiar symbol freshly drawn in what appeared to be coal dust. 3 connected circles, each containing a stylized eye. Understanding at last what his grandfather and Thomas Parkerson had discovered, that some truths are too dangerous to uncover, some histories too terrible to resurrect, Howard abandoned his plan to break the seal. Instead, he hiked to the nearest town, mailed his field notes to one of his trusted colleagues, and checked into a motel under a false name. It was the last confirmed sighting of Howard Mercer. His car was found a week later at a bus station in Charleston, West Virginia. His bank accounts remained untouched. His position at the college was filled after he was declared legally dead in 1985. His research notes, mailed to colleagues, never arrived at their destinations. The manuscript of The Erased was never published. The story of Crower's Gap and its disappeared residents might have ended there, lost like so many other dark chapters of American history, if not for a curious discovery made in 2003. During the renovation of an old Philadelphia row house, construction workers found a metal box sealed inside a wall cavity. Inside was a copy of Howard Mercer's manuscript, along with copies of Thomas Parkerson's journal, William Cooper's map, and a letter addressed "To Whom It May Concern," dated August 17, 1978. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then I am almost certainly gone, removed not just from life, but from memory itself. My name is Howard Mercer. My grandfather was Elijah Mercer, a census taker, who in 1904 stumbled upon a conspiracy so vast and terrifying that even now, 74 years later, I can scarcely believe it myself. But the evidence is real. The disappeared were real, and those responsible are still among us, still practicing their terrible art of erasure." The box and its contents were turned over to the current homeowner, a journalism professor at Temple University named Katherine Weiss. Intrigued by the strange materials and their disturbing implications, Weiss began her own investigation. Unlike her predecessors, she had the advantage of the Internet, the ability to cross-reference historical records, corporate filings, and government documents without leaving a paper trail that could be easily monitored. She also had the wisdom to keep her research private, telling no one what she had found, not even her closest colleagues. For over a year, she worked in secret, using public records to verify what she could of Howard Mercer's claims. She traced the corporate lineage of the Crowers Gap Mining Company through a labyrinth of mergers, acquisitions, and name changes, eventually connecting it to a modern defense contractor with government ties. She found patterns of disappearances in the census data from other mining towns marked on Cooper's map. She discovered gaps in the records of certain government agencies that aligned with the time frames mentioned in Parkerson's journal. And most disturbing of all, she began to notice discrepancies in her own memory. Notes she didn't remember taking. Research she couldn't recall conducting. Pages missing from her files that no one else had access to. In the spring of 2004, Katherine Weiss made a decision. She would go public with everything she had found, consequences be damned. She compiled her research into a comprehensive digital file, encrypted it, and scheduled it to be automatically emailed to hundreds of recipients, journalists, academics, civil rights attorneys, members of Congress, if she failed to enter a password every 24 hours. Then she did what Howard Mercer had done 26 years earlier. She went to Crowers Gap. Unlike Howard, she had no intention of breaking the seal on the North Shaft. She wanted only to document the site, to photograph the evidence that the town had existed, that the mine had existed, that the events described in Parkerson's journal could have happened as written. She arrived on a clear day in early May, exactly 100 years after Elijah Mercer had conducted his ill-fated census. The forest had continued its slow reclamation of the town's site. Even the stone foundations Howard had described were now barely visible beneath a century of accumulated soil and vegetation. But the mountains themselves remained, their ancient silhouettes unchanged by time. Weiss hiked the overgrown path that had once been the town's main street, using Parkerson's maps and Howard's notes to identify where key buildings had stood. The general store where Elijah had set up his census office, the church where town meetings were held, the Parkerson house on the hill, now reduced to a crumbling chimney and a rectangle of fieldstone that had been the foundation. She took photographs, made notes, collected soil samples, and as the afternoon shadows lengthened, she made her way toward the site of the North Shaft. What Katherine Weiss found at the North Shaft changed everything. The concrete cap that Howard Mercer had described was still there, but it was no longer intact. At some point in the 26 years since Howard's visit, someone, or something, had broken through the seal. A jagged hole approximately 3 feet in diameter gaped in the center of the concrete slab. Around the opening, the ground was bare of vegetation, the soil darkened as if by intense heat. And leading away from the shaft, clearly visible in the disturbed earth, were footprints. Dozens of them of various sizes, all heading in the same direction toward what had once been the town of Crowers Gap. Weiss approached the opening cautiously, camera in hand. The hole was too dark to see into without additional light, and she hadn't brought a powerful enough flashlight for deep exploration. But she needed to document what she'd found. Keeping a safe distance, she photographed the broken seal and the footprints from multiple angles. As she worked, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountainside. In the fading light, she noticed something else, a familiar symbol scratched into the concrete near the opening, 3 connected circles, each containing a stylized eye. The warning. Katherine Weiss was not a superstitious woman. As a journalist, she prided herself on her rationality, her commitment to facts over speculation. But standing there as darkness fell, alone on a mountainside where terrible things had happened a century before, she felt a primal fear take hold. It was time to leave. She packed her equipment quickly and began making her way back down the overgrown path toward where she had parked her car, about a mile away. Night was falling faster than she had anticipated, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. She switched on her flashlight, its beam seeming feeble against the encroaching darkness. That was when she heard it, the sound described by both Lily Mercer in 1904 and Howard Mercer in 1978. A low, rumbling groan, like the mountain itself was stirring from sleep, and following it, barely audible at first, but growing louder, the whispering, words just at the edge of comprehension, spoken in voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Katherine broke into a run, stumbling down the path, branches whipping at her face in the darkness. Behind her, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. And now there were footsteps, too, many sets of them, moving through the forest with unnatural coordination. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. In the beam of her flashlight, she caught glimpses of figures moving between the trees. Men, women, children, their clothing old-fashioned, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the light like those of animals caught in headlights. The disappeared of Crower's Gap, returning from whatever void had claimed them. Katherine reached her car, fumbled with the keys, finally managed to unlock the door and throw herself inside. As she started the engine, her headlights illuminated the path ahead, and standing in it, blocking her exit, was a man she recognized from the photographs she'd found in her research, Thomas Parkerson, looking exactly as he had in 1904, his expression one of infinite sorrow. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the closed windows of her car. "Some things are meant to stay buried." Katherine's foot hit the accelerator. The car lurched forward, and Parkerson dissolved like smoke in a strong breeze as the vehicle passed through the space where he had been standing. She didn't slow down until she reached the main highway, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Back in her hotel room, Katherine uploaded the photographs she had taken to her laptop and sent them to the secure email account she had set up for her research. Only then did she examine them closely. The pictures of the town site were clear enough. The overgrown foundations, the crumbling chimney, the fieldstone rectangle that had once supported the Parkerson house. But the photographs of the north shaft, the broken concrete seal, the footprints leading away from it, those showed nothing but undisturbed forest floor. And in place of the symbol she had so carefully documented, there was only unbroken concrete. The evidence was gone, as if it had never existed. Katherine Weiss returned to Philadelphia the next day, deeply shaken by her experience, but more determined than ever to bring the truth to light. The disappeared of Crower's Gap, and all the others who had been erased over the decades, deserved to have their stories told, their existence acknowledged. She spent the next week finalizing her research, cross-checking her sources, and preparing for the public release of everything she had discovered. 3 days before her scheduled publication date, she noticed the symbol, 3 connected circles, each containing a stylized eye, drawn in the condensation on her bathroom mirror. The warning: she didn't run. Instead, she triggered her failsafe immediately, sending her encrypted files to hundreds of recipients hours before anyone could reach her. Then she sat down at her kitchen table, poured herself a glass of wine, and waited. They came at midnight, 3 figures in dark clothing who entered her apartment without triggering the alarm system. Katherine watched them approach with surprising calm, noting the clinical precision of their movements, the lack of emotion in their pale faces. "You're too late," she told them. "It's already out there. Hundreds of copies sent to people who will make sure it spreads." The leader of the group, a thin man with silver-streaked hair, smiled thinly. That's what Howard Mercer thought too, and Thomas Parkerson before him. Yet here we are, a century later, still keeping the secret. "How?" Katherine demanded. "How can you possibly contain something like this in the age of the Internet?" "The same way we always have," the man replied. "By making people forget. Not just you, everyone you sent it to, everyone they shared it with. The beauty of our method is its thoroughness. By this time tomorrow it will be as if your research never existed, as if you never existed. He removed a small device from his pocket, something that looked like an inhaler, filled with what appeared to be black sand. A more refined delivery system than what they used in Parkinson's day. Less messy, more targeted. You won't feel a thing. Katherine Weiss closed her eyes as he raised the device to her face. Her last conscious thought was of the disappeared. Samuel Thatcher, Ada Thatcher, the Wilcox family, old Mr. Holloway, the Parkinsons, William Cooper, Howard Mercer, and countless others whose names had been struck from the record. People who had lived and loved and struggled and died, only to be erased as if they had never been. In the morning, Katherine's neighbor noticed that her apartment door was standing open. Concerned, she looked inside and found the place empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had lived there recently. When she asked the building manager about it, he informed her that apartment 3B had been vacant for months, awaiting renovation. When she insisted that a woman named Katherine Weiss had been living there just yesterday, he checked his records and found no such tenant. By afternoon, the neighbor was beginning to doubt her own memory. Had she imagined a tenant in the empty apartment? Had she dreamed the conversations she thought she'd had with a woman named Katherine? By evening, she had forgotten the matter entirely. And Katherine Weiss, like Elijah Mercer, like William Cooper, like Howard Mercer, like Thomas Parkinson, and all the disappeared of Crower's Gap, became another name crossed out of history, another person erased from memory, another ghost haunting the dark hollows of Appalachia, whispering truths that no one remembers long enough to believe. But there is one thing the people who wield the black mercury, the ones who erase and control and rewrite, have never understood. Truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. Stories have power that transcends individual tellers. And somewhere, perhaps in an archive no one has searched, or a wall cavity not yet discovered, or a hope chest passed down through generations, the evidence remains, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to bring it into the light once more. As for Crower's Gap, the town's site continues its slow return to wilderness. The forest reclaims the land year by year, erasing the last physical traces of human habitation. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind blows from the north, hikers in those remote mountains report strange sounds, a rumbling groan like the earth shifting in its sleep, followed by whispering voices just at the edge of hearing. Words almost, but not quite, comprehensible. And sometimes, glimpsed between the trees, pale figures moving in the darkness. The disappeared, still trying to tell their story, still trying not to be forgotten. Still warning those who will listen, some truths are buried for a reason. Some secrets are kept at terrible cost, and some things once seen can never be unseen, even if everyone else in the world has forgotten they exist. The most terrifying truth about the disappeared of Crower's Gap isn't that they were erased from history. It's that it could happen to any of us, that it might be happening still in quiet towns and government offices and corporate boardrooms across the country. People removed not just from life, but from memory itself, leaving nothing behind but a faint echo, a lingering sense of something missing, a name crossed out in a ledger that no one will ever read. So if you find yourself in the mountains of West Virginia, in a hollow that seems somehow emptier than it should be, pay attention to what isn't there, to the spaces between what you can see, to the silences between what you can hear. And if you notice a symbol drawn in dust or dirt or condensation, 3 connected circles, each containing a stylized eye, don't wait, don't pack, don't say goodbye. Just run, and never stop looking over your shoulder. Because the people who control the black mercury, who master the art of erasure, who decide who deserves to be remembered and who doesn't, they're still out there, still watching, still collecting names for their ledgers, and yours might be next.